Okay. James, are you ready? I think we're ready to get started.
Okay.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. I see a lot of people joining us this evening from afar. We're so grateful to have so many participants tonight to celebrate the launch of James Prosek Artifact Artifice. This is the gallery's first ever virtual book launch. So please bear with us. We are praying to the Zoom gods that everything goes well. I like to joke that I like to make print books. I'm not the most technologically advanced, so fingers crossed, but we've got a good team to help us out tonight. My name is Tiffany Sprague. I'm the Director of Publications here at the Gallery, and it has been my pleasure to work with James on this project. We're going to get started, but before we do, I just wanted to share a few housekeeping notes I mentioned a little bit earlier, but for those of you who are still trickling in, please just note that tonight's program is being recorded, available on our YouTube channel later on. We have turned your sound and camera off on our end so that we can focus on James and the slides that I'm going to show you. We will have time for a Q&A portion of our program later on this evening, and we would love to hear what you'd like to hear James talk about. So please use the Q&A feature of Zoom to submit questions that he can answer. You'll find that feature on your Zoom navigation bar, which is generally at the top of your screen, sometimes down at the bottom. If you guys have any problems with technology tonight, please let us know. We're here to help you. We have a couple people monitoring the chat, so feel free to drop us a note in there. And we'd also just love to know where you're all calling from. So if you want to give us a note in the chat to just say hello, let us know how you heard about the program, tell us where you're from, that would be great. Before we get started, I also just wanted to share a few shout outs and thank yous to the many people who were involved in bringing the project and tonight's event to fruition. First and foremost for tonight, thanks to Marlene Theodore, our Associate Curator of Programs, for her continued support of our publications program at the Gallery and for helping to generate conversations around our books, as well as to her team, Jake Gagne and Elizabeth Harnett. In the publications department, I'd like to thank Jennifer Liu, who helped not only with our publication and bringing the catalog to fruition, but helped organize this evening's event. Speaking of the catalog, thanks to Christopher Sloboda for his wonderful design of the book and helping to bring James's words and images to life. In addition to James's own words in the book, we have a really wonderful essay by Edith Devaney. Edith is head of summer exhibitions and contemporary curator at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and we're so grateful to have had her participation and collaboration on this project. I am especially pleased to have the opportunity to acknowledge the donors who supported the project. Thank you to Donna and Marvin Schwartz for their support of the publication, and to Susan and Stephen Mandel, as well as David Polk and the Richard P. Jarmany Fund at the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, who all helped underwrite the exhibition. Special thanks to Waqas Wajahat for all of his assistance in bringing the project to fruition. And finally, thank you to the Milton and Sally Avery Arts Foundation for making tonight's program possible. And with that, I think we can get started. So we are thrilled to have artist, writer, and naturalist James Prosek here with us this evening. For those of you who are local to New Haven, you may be familiar with James and his work. James has had a long and deep relationship with the university. James received his BA from Yale in 1997. He was the 2018 Happy and Bob Doran Artist in Residence at the Gallery. James serves as a curatorial affiliate and board member of the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. And he's also a member of the advisory board of the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies. James's work first gained a worldwide following with his popular book, Trout, An Illustrated History, which was published when the artist was just 20 years old and still a student at Yale. Since then, he's gone on to write numerous articles and publications that speak to his deep connection with the natural world, which serves as the basis for his art. His artwork has been shown at museums and galleries worldwide, and he has had solo exhibitions at institutions ranging from the Philadelphia Museum of Art to the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. The genesis of the present project dates back a number of years during James's residency at the gallery, but when I first met him, he told me that this was a project he had been thinking about and wanting to make for a very long time. The catalog accompanies an exhibition at the gallery, which was curated by the artist. In the exhibition and the related catalog, James juxtaposes man-made and nature-made objects drawn from the Yale University Art Gallery, the Yale Center for British Art, and the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History, as well as his own work, some newly made specifically for the project. The fundamental question posed by the project is, what is art and what is artifact, and to what extent do these distinctions matter? In James's eyes, nature is a wondrous, interconnected system. Though undeniably helpful in allowing us to make sense of things, the labels, categories, and classifications that we impose upon the world through language and other means also limit how we view that world. Our boxes box us in, causing us to segregate rather than celebrate the beauty and diversity of the natural world. In the 9 titled sections of the catalog, seemingly disparate objects are thus, in James's hands, made less so. In mark making, for instance, a bird's egg, the patterns on it made while the egg is passed through the birth canal, is juxtaposed with a Jackson Pollock painting. In hybridity, a quintessential Prosek hybrid, a tongue-in-cheek play on words in which a parrotfish becomes literally part parrot and part fish, is juxtaposed with a bird figure with cat-like ears from the 5th to 3rd century BC. And in perhaps the most striking juxtaposition, the skull of the Peabody's Torosaurus latus, the largest skull of any animal known to have walked the earth, is placed alongside a modern sculpture by the British artist Barbara Hepworth. As James discussed in his recent blog post for Yale University Press, the 3 holes in the dinosaur skull seem to echo those in the sculpture. And the triangularity of the 3 holes in each is further echoed in the triangular forms of the ceiling of the gallery's Louis Kahn building where they're installed in front of a mural by James Prosek. Other objects similarly speak to James's desire to challenge the traditional boundaries of museum collections into strict categories of fine art and artifact, as when he places a Martin Puryear sculpture opposite an Inuit fish figurine, juxtaposes one of his own watercolors of a fish with 2 ivory objects depicting seals, or compares Philip Guston drawings to the hieroglyphs on a horse rib. Whether James is talking about the history of naming or the liminal spaces between the named and the unnamed, his essays and comparisons prompt us to look afresh at objects that we thought we knew so well. The common thread throughout these varied groups of images is that nature makes things, whether artists like Van Gogh with paint and canvas, or birds building nests out of twigs, and that the distinction between these 2 groups is perhaps not as vast as we may believe. The introduction to the catalog sets the reader up to enter James's world, where cockatoos are turned into cockatools, a wasp's nest is a pencil holder, nature is art, and art is nature. It also shares a story from James's childhood that seemingly set him off on this path of inquiry, a story related to the gnarled tree you see here near his childhood home, with a no trespassing sign that marks an otherwise invisible boundary of a reservoir. To learn more, please help me welcome James Prosek, who will now read from the introduction to James Prosek, Art, Artifact, Artifice.
Thank you, Tiffany, for such a beautiful introduction. And I am reading here from my studio in Easton, Connecticut, which is about 30 minutes from the Yale University Art Gallery. I'll give you a quick virtual tour. A lot of stuff on the floor. The floor is kind of like a big desk. And I am extremely thrilled to be here reading to you guys. This exhibition has been a dream project. I wish that I could see you in person and give you a hug, but that's not possible, so virtual hug. And yeah, I want to just thank a couple of people before I read. Jock Reynolds initially, the former director of the Art Gallery, initiated the idea for this exhibition to juxtapose objects from the Yale Peabody Museum and the Yale University Art Gallery, and gave me a chance to do the Happy and Bob Doran Artists in Residence in 2018. Stephanie Wiles, the current director, is the one who really made the exhibition happen, and Thank you for Stephanie for believing in the ideas in this crazy project. And Tiffany, thank you for your incredible editing work and seeing this book through to fruition. So I will now deliver my commencement speech from outer space. Wish I could hear you laugh if you're laughing, but here we go. I'm actually reading from a physical book. This is what it looks like. And this is the introduction that Tiffany showed a slide of. Nature makes things. It is restless and testing the limits of what can possibly exist, experimenting to produce what Charles Darwin called endless forms most beautiful. As children of evolution, humans inherit, embody, and extend this need to make things, relentlessly pushing the possibilities of form and structure in ways both useful and seemingly useless. The objects in this publication and its related exhibition, whether shaped by the forces of evolution, like the skull of a dinosaur, or the bodies of colorful birds, or made by the very creatures that evolution has shaped, like man-made vessels or birds' nests, celebrate the beauty and diversity of nature. The juxtapositions of images are meant to suggest poetic echoes and tensions among and between things. At the same time, they test the boundaries we have traditionally set up between art and nature, posing various questions like, what is art and what is artifact? And to what extent do these distinctions matter? Are they helpful, enabling us to see things we otherwise would not? Or do they limit what we are able to see by drawing artificial boundaries around the magnificent productions of a wondrous and interconnected world? Context shapes how we perceive and treat things, so our categories and classifications, though perhaps arbitrary, are nevertheless important and worthy of examination. Whether we see something and identify it as one thing, when we see something and identify it as one thing or as fitting within a certain category, it often loses the potential to be something else. Why should we limit our thoughts and ideas in this way? We exist deeply, perhaps too much so, in a world of concepts of our own invention, made to the reduction of an endlessly complex world. Too often what we end up with in the process of coming to know the world is a metamorphosis of the world into man, in the words of Nietzsche. Our brains evolved to be nimble, to simplify and order the messy, to extract only what is necessary for day-to-day existence, to edit out what is not essential for survival. We prefer the world as filtered by our minds, where it can be made orderly and intelligible, because then we feel we know it, and knowing brings comfort. If we live too much through the lens of our predispositions and the tools we have evolved, our languages and concepts that reflect them, and not in the world itself, we miss out on an essential aspect of human experience, a direct, unmediated, sensual engagement with the natural world. Once the complex and chaotic world is made legible through our taxonomies and systems of classification, we attempt to control it. Political regimes have announced and carried out terrifying projects that attempt to force the world to conform to our mental reductions. Racism, sexism, religious discrimination, intolerance of myriad kinds emerge from a belief that there is some ideal form or way of being. But there is no such thing as an ideal form. The health of our planet depends on an understanding and acceptance that the world is a system, not a place made up of units that fit into neat mental boxes. If we wish to make investigations into disorderly zones where some of the most interesting things happen, we must find ways to override our strongest urges and inclinations. That is what this book and exhibition in part are meant to urge us to do. The lines we draw between things, the categories into which we place things, the structures we impose on the world to communicate, and the choices we make based on our personal prejudices can shape not only the way we and others think, but also the future of ourselves as a species and the future of nature. Over time, humans have learned to manipulate the forces of evolution. Through thousands of years of selective breeding, we have made wolves into pugs, we have wired trees to grow in fetishistic miniature, bonsai. We have trained and pruned fruit trees to grow in neat geometric shapes, espalier or topiary. We have genetically engineered plants to be resistant to predatory insects. In each of these examples and in countless others, we have attempted to harness the vastness and complexity of nature, to bend nature to our will, perhaps under the illusion that we can render it manageable. At the same time, we learned to make representations of nature through drawing, painting, making three-dimensional objects, even writing, which evolved from drawing. Seeking to communicate our environment through a kind of mental domestication, reducing forms in nature to symbols over which we feel we have control. And through mimicry, such as the making of decoys and lures, another form of representation of nature, we were able to attain subtle power over the habits of non-human animals, to draw prey closer, make us better able to catch and kill the creatures that sustain us. Imitation and representation are both devices of artifice, used by artists and artisans as well as by nature. Through the forces of evolution, many creatures have come to mimic others to sustain themselves. For instance, evolving to look like a toxic species to frighten predators, or to look uncannily like the plant on which they forage so as to be camouflaged. Darwin believed that our first sounds and words, our earliest language, were in imitation of bird song. Indeed, some of our words to this day are onomatopoeic, like chickadee. As hunters know, the imitation of an animal's sound, like the call of an elk or the gobbling of a turkey, is an oral decoy that can attract prey, another example of how mimicry and artifice have helped humans survive. We represented nature in part to trick it. As a consequence, we forged a more intimate relationship with it. The act of representation helped us to focus our attention on our surroundings, strengthen our skills of observation, our minds, our memories, our imaginations. Imitation enabled a kind of cross-species engagement, connecting our brains to the brains of other animals and creating a hybrid worlds of thought. For example, if you lure an elk toward you by imitating its call, you have engaged its mind with yours. Early innovations of imitation and representation, drawing and carving, coupled with spoken words that represented things and eventually written language, pictographs and hieroglyphs, as well as alphabets, have collectively allowed us to create a secondary nature. Once we had the ability to craft a simulated world, a new dynamic developed between the represented world and the world it was based on, a dance between the named and unnamed worlds. Many of the object groupings in this publication speak to an essential question pertaining to arguably the most powerful tool of representation and reduction that humans have ever invented: language. What happens when words are joined to a world that does not have words on it? Nature is an interconnected system, an undivided evolutionary continuum going back several billion years. To communicate this holistic continuum through language, we have to draw lines between things and label the pieces, a necessary process in the creation, retention, and dissemination of knowledge. But when we do this, the recipients of this knowledge inherit a fragmented world and lose sight of the interconnected nature of nature. We come to live in the map of our making instead of the territory. We must constantly remind ourselves that the map is not the terrain. The danger comes when the lines we draw in nature, which should be permeable and temporary, become ossified and fixed, and we can no longer see beyond them because we are too busy defending them. The challenge is to communicate and celebrate the beauty of diversity on our planet without embracing an ethos of division. Humans may need to reduce complexity and impose order so as to communicate and navigate the world, but nature will always trespass across the boundaries that we attempt to set upon it. In investigating the human urge to name, order, and classify the world, my own inquiry has been at times less about the objects and the names that accompany them than about the boundaries we draw in our minds in order to have things. I turned to my own early relationship with boundaries to try to understand how and why we encounter them, how they might affect us, and how we might try to overcome them. I grew up in southwestern Connecticut next to a drinking water reservoir, surrounded by hundreds of acres of watershed land that had been set aside to buffer and naturally filter the water. This land, once mostly farm fields, grew back into forests and now forms a kind of mini wilderness. My road had at one time continued into the center of town, but it was cut off when the valley was flooded to form the reservoir. Today, the street dead ends at the watershed land. It was here as a kid that I encountered no trespassing signs, marking the limits of the land owned by the water company. These signs became beacons for me, and their authority stirred me to contradict them. Deer, turkeys, foxes, squirrels, and other animals crossed the line. Why couldn't I? The boundary also presented a conflict in my mind. This land would not have been protected without the boundary, but at the same time, I had trouble with public access being denied, particularly to me. With this line came both merits and faults, sometimes indistinguishable, but one thing was certain: the line had an effect on me. Crossing the line was empowering and exciting, and not only because the land and the creatures on the other side were beautiful, or because the fishing was so good in the reservoir. It was the questioning of the line, the small act of anarchism embedded in the trespass that was so thrilling. As much as I mistrusted the line, I cannot imagine what my life would have been like had it not been there. In one instance of crossing the line, I met one of my most important mentors, a game warden named Joe Haynes, who caught me fishing illegally on the wrong side of it. We had a fundamental difference of opinion about what the line stood for. He in his late 50s and I aged 13. To him, the line was very real. As a law enforcement officer, his livelihood depended on upholding and defending the meaning of this boundary. To me, the line was arbitrary. It was ours, not nature's. As my friendship with the old game warden grew, however, part of my education from him beyond skills related to hunting, fishing, and foraging was that rules were important and that some lines must be respected, even if nature did not recognize them. I also acknowledge that as much as I may have rejected the line, it changed my life by introducing me to this knowledgeable local man who nurtured my young spirit. In my early adolescence, about the same time that I was trespassing by the reservoir, I began to ask other questions that only years later I came to see as related. These were about words, or more specifically names, like those of birds and trees, the authority they projected, the often fictional lines that needed to be drawn in nature for them to exist, our dependence on those lines in daily life, and their limitations in expressing the beauty of the natural world as I was coming to know it. If I accepted the names that others had bestowed on nature and saw the world exclusively through the lens they provided, then I was surrendering to a kind of familiarity and predetermined knowledge and was missing out on an experience that was novel to me. It was as if I were presented with an open wood and invited to explore it, but was told that I could not leave the path that had already been cut through the undergrowth. The existing path would allow me to traverse the wood and to see its beauty with less effort than if I had to cut the path myself. But at the same time, my perspective would be limited to that specific vantage. More often than not, I wanted to go off the trail, and I didn't like being told that I could not. The more I have examined the nature of boundaries, the more I have examined the nature of boundaries, the more elusive and complex the analysis has become. It is not as simple as walls are good or walls are bad. One of the most concise illustrations of the ironies and paradoxes embedded in boundaries can be found in a poem by Robert Frost from 1914 called Mending Wall. Up until the early 20th century, it was common practice in rural New England for two neighbors to meet along a shared property line in spring and mend the wall, placing rocks back on the wall that had fallen the previous winter from frost heaving the ground. The poet begins with an observation. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. And later, something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. Nature, Frost notes, will eventually find a way to pull down boundaries, given enough time. While engaged in mending, the narrator, with the spring mischief in him, asks why they're bothering to mend the wall at all, since they no longer have livestock that need to be walled in. The response from his old Yankee neighbor is simply, "Good fences make good neighbors." The proverb is a wall in itself, meant to settle the argument, conversation closed. Mending Wall became one of Frost's most famous poems, an allegory for everything from discussions about political borders to personal space. And he was faced with legions of admirers and interviewers who wished to hear his personal point of view on the matter. Which character was he in the poem? Was he in favor of walls or against them? Frustrating for some, perhaps, Frost answered with ambivalence. "I don't know, maybe I was both fellows in the poem." On another occasion, he was quoted as saying, "We will always have walls, have always had them. While some are being torn down, others are being built up." In 1957, the New York Times quoted Frost responding to boundaries metaphorically, comparing the biological walls in our bodies to the questions raised in the poem. "All life is cellular. We live by the breaking down of cells and the building up of new cells. Change is constant and unavoidable. That is the way it is with human beings and with nations." One may think of a wall at first as something that divides, that separates both neighbors and nations. But one of the beautiful ironies of Frost's poem is that the wall and the activity of mending it are what bring the two neighbors together in the first place. Walls can separate, but they can also unite. I met my mentor, the old Yankee game warden, because of a line, one represented by a no trespassing sign. Lines in the mind, like those between us and them, or those on a map, invisible on the ground, intangible lines in the world, fences or walls, are equally powerful. They influence our thoughts and feelings as well as our destinies. Today, I live on the same street on which I grew up, and I still take walks in the same woods where I walked as a child. I return often to the point of my early trespassing, the property line around the reservoir I used to cross as a kid to fish illegally. I know many of the metal no trespassing signs, yellow with black lettering, as individuals, each with a unique relationship to the trees on which they're nailed. I remember clearly 30 years ago when the wardens changed all the signs. The old rusted signs read, "No hunting, trapping, or fishing." The new signs read, "No hunting, swimming, or fishing," an emblem of changing times. Decades later, one large sugar maple tree is engulfing a once unblemished sign. See the frontispiece of this essay. We showed the picture. Its bark has grown around the corners, concealing the no in no trespassing. Is the tree winking at me, inviting my trespassing? As the tree grows larger, it consumes the sign and tears it down the middle, aided by oxidation from years of rainstorms and humidity. This is not the only line the tree has ingested. Poking out from the shaggy bark at its base are segments of a barbed wire fence that once ran between cedar posts, parallel to an older stone wall when these were farm fields and not forests, 100 years ago or more. I have been told that trees do not talk, at least not in the sense that we can understand their communication. But here is a visual example that illustrates the thesis of my inquiry better than words on a page can. The lines we draw may be useful to us, even necessary, and are often beautiful, but they're all ultimately ephemeral. Thank you. I did realize I forgot to thank one person at the beginning, who's Larry Cantor, the chief curator, who really helped guide my hand through what was a very complicated exhibition to put together, because we started with like 200 objects on a checklist and he had to help edit me down, as Tiffany did with the words, but thank you.
Thank you so much, James. That was such a great reading, and I hope that everybody enjoyed that. I have got to, before we get into the Q&A portion, I really just have to give a shout out to this chat that's happening and share some of it with you, because I know you've been reading, so you haven't had a chance to look at it. But we have people chiming in from all over the place, and in a period that has been, you know, so difficult for so many of us, being cooped up and not being able to have a sense of community. It's super heartening to see what's going on in this chat. So we've got people calling from Houston, Vermont, Los Angeles, East Hampton, Massachusetts, Indianapolis, Kansas City, Georgia, Maine, New York, Florida, even Geneva, Switzerland. So shout out to all of you and the many, many more people who are commenting. I'm seeing a lot of notes about people being a fan of fly fishing, which of course is one of James's interests as well. I am seeing that some people were luckily able to see the exhibition and how much they enjoyed it before the museum was forced to close because of the pandemic. We do have an audio tour available for the exhibition, which you can access from home. So maybe somebody on my end could put that link in the chat for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to see the show. I also wanted to, there's one chat in here that's just too good to pass up. I've got Maureen Shanley, who is apparently your English teacher, former English teacher from the Helen Keller Middle School. She's now in Lakeland, Florida, but she wishes you the best. So I just wanted to
I can still sing the auxiliary verb song that Maureen Shanley taught me.
So
we're
gonna move into the Q&A portion. I want to make sure that we have enough time to get some of these questions answered. We've had several questions come through. If you guys haven't yet submitted something, please feel free to continue to submit. We are taking a look at it as we go along. But I think we're going to start with something a little light and move to some of the more the heavier ones that I see here, which I also definitely want to address. The light one is something that you and I have talked about recently as well, which is that James is very, very well read. And if you've read the book, or looked at some of the previews that we've had online, you'll notice that, and even from the introduction that he just read, you'll notice that he cites people far and wide, poets, fiction writers, nonfiction writers, anthropologists, scientists, etc. But Maggie Adler is asking if you can tell us a little bit about what you're reading now or what you're planning to read. We're all so cooped up with the pandemic. I think we've got a lot of books on the list right now.
I should just grab some from the floor, but right now I'm always reading a lot of different things. I'm reading a book called Soul Hunters, which is by a Danish anthropologist named Rain Willerslev, about a group of people in Siberia who have a close relationship with the elk that they hunt. They put on, you know, elk skins when they go out elk hunting, and they even sort of do little dances, because I'm interested in this mimicry that humans, and representation and artifice that humans do in order to sort of have a more intimate relationship with nature, which sometimes also means killing the animal to eat. But there's a space that they try not to cross when they're in the midst of their imitation, where the hunter is so in the game that they feel like they could actually turn into an elk. And if they do turn into the elk in the course of their imitation, then there's no coming back. I can identify with that on some level, because in my teens, I was so into fishing for trout, and I was using these little imitations of insects that I used to catch the trout, that I felt like there were times that I was sort of trying to get into the mind of a fish. I know it's a cliche, think like a fish when you're fishing, but I've had some interesting conversations with Michael Dove at Yale about this, an anthropologist. But yeah, I'm always reading lots of different things. Actually, I'd never read Silent Spring before, and I'm reading that right now, partly because I'm writing an article for National Geographic about the Gulf of Maine, about climate change and how it's affecting the water temperatures in the Gulf of Maine. But Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring mostly from a cabin in Southport, Maine, on the shores of the Gulf of Maine. And I think that it's such an inspiring place. So many artists and writers have spent time there making work, from George O'Keeffe to Marsden Hartley. Yeah, cut me off if I go too long, because I can't judge when the audience is falling asleep. So
James is very used to being edited by me, so I will keep him in line tonight.
But no, I'm always reading a lot of different things, and but yeah, thank you, Maggie, for that.
That was
question.
a good segue, what you just mentioned, into another question here, which is why I wanted to turn your attention to that one. John Ravenel, who I believe is an art historian and curator, is writing in. He says, this is obviously an incredibly fraught time for humans in relation to nature due to climate change. In the face of this, is there something or some things that give you hope?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think generally an optimist. I think, and also I think in longer geological scale time, the Earth will heal itself after we destroy it. It'll just might take 10 million years. You know, my question is, what kind of world do we want to live in? And we talk about nature as a resource or something that we exploit for our own use. Naturally, it has a life of its own outside of our use for nature. But yeah, one in this, again, I'll go back to the Gulf of Maine story. While the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the oceans of the world, and it's changing the habitat and affecting the lobster fishery and everything that Maine's famous for. At the same time, Maine has embarked in the last 15 years on some very significant removal of dams from major rivers like the Penobscot, the Kennebec, the Presumpscot River. One of the dams on the Presumpscot River was built at the head of tide, which means at the highest high tide line, right where the river's going into the sea, at about 250 years ago, I think. And so for 250 years, no fish were able to migrate up that river. And the day they breached the dam, the day the first water sort of came through where there had been essentially a blocked artery in Earth's circulatory system, the fish, alewives, river herring, shad started to come up within an hour of taking the dam down. Now there's several million fish coming up the Presumpscot. There's 70,000 fish running up this little tributary called Millbrook, which is in Westbrook, Maine, not far from Portland. And people come to see this wildlife migration that was essentially blocked for hundreds of years. And nature's resilience gives me optimism. I spent 12 years working on a book about freshwater eels and the importance of eels culturally around the world, particularly in Micronesia and Polynesia. And eels are just really tough ass fish. I mean, you can, as a kid, I would try to get my hook out of them and sometimes brutalize them. You throw them in the water and they just swim away. And it was in my sad past, but yeah, I do have hope in nature, but I think we have evolved, as I read in the introduction, an instinct to fragment and chop the world up into pieces. We fragment it mentally, and then we fragment it physically by building roads, dams, diversions. We have to really constantly remind ourselves that the Earth is an interconnected system, and we have to try to mend some of those spaces that we've kind of created and allow these migrations and important interconnected things to happen. But
also follows, I think, on another question that I'm seeing here, which is, you know, sort of inevitable. I don't think we can have this conversation in this type of situation without talking about the fact that there's a pandemic going on.
Yeah.
Jenny Parsons says, I'd like to hear James reflect on how the pandemic has evolved his thinking or maybe inspiring new directions in his work. His thesis about interconnectedness is more relevant than ever. Thank
you, Jenny. Yeah, I think the pandemic and the coronavirus is helping prove our thesis, which is basically that we think that we are these organisms separate from nature, humans, because we think we're so important. But one of the boundaries that I hoped we could try to soften is the boundary not between different human cultures, which is part of the show too, but the boundary between human and non-human animals, because animals can't speak to us and we can't speak to them. So we just presume that they're other than us. And we create this us versus them kind of situation. But really we can't really say that we're even organisms unto ourselves, as John Donne said in his poem, not saying this about this topic, of course, but no man is an island unto itself. No human is an island. No, you aren't separate from the main. A human, even down to the individual level, the human body is a system. There are more cells of non-human animals, bacteria, on and in our bodies than there are cells of humans, and that help us digest food and fight disease and sometimes kill us. But we are not islands unto ourselves. I don't even think it's accurate to think of a human being as a species separate from other things. Species is a term of convenience. I think it's a human invention, not something that's real. It's a segment of a continuum that we have to chop off in order to have something to call something. It's like the color red on a color spectrum. There's no such thing as red. It's just a segment of a color spectrum that we choose to decide where the boundary is between red and the next color. We can define that space mathematically or by other means, but that line is a fiction. And once we draw the maps, though, to navigate these boxes that we've drawn, the problem is, as I said in the introduction, that we forget that they're fictional, and then we live by them, and it causes all kinds of problems related to some of the very serious social issues that are happening right now and are not new, and hopefully will go away one day. But I think if humans had a better grasp of how biology worked and actually believed in it, then we may be able to overcome some of these boundaries. But one of the great things about art, and we sort of discussed this with words and not with words, is that humans have other ways of communicating that don't necessarily involve division. And art making is about, science has to sort of fragment the world and label the pieces in order to try to figure out what the whole is. But you can try to kind of understand the human brain by studying different parts of it. But when you put those parts back together, the whole is something very different. And who will be able to ever describe what memory is or sentience and how that happens? Artists, sort of disregard the how it works, and they just try to capture the beautiful ephemeral qualities of experience. And anyway, sorry.
You mentioned the color spectrum, so let's talk a little bit about that. For those of you who've seen the cover of the catalog, or maybe James, you could hold it up one more time there. James has made this remarkable object out of over 200 birds from the ornithology collection of the Peabody Museum of Natural History. I included a slide in my remarks earlier and a detail. And I know you've said, James, that there's only about 20 museums in the whole world that have as large and diverse of collection in order to make a spectrum such as that. So James's bird spectrum is being commented on in the Q&A as well. And Mark Aronson, who is a colleague of ours at the Yale Center for British Art and is an avid bird watcher, I know, asks about the bird spectrum. When you selected the birds for the rainbow, were you exclusively thinking of finding the colors to make the rainbow? Or did you also seek to represent certain species for their character or your relationship to that species?
I think I caught that there was a little breakup there, but.
Want me to repeat it, or are you good?
I think I got it. Did I choose them specifically for their color, or were there other reasons? Yeah, some of there were definitely some personal you know, underneath the cover, there's sort of a more close-up version. Each of these, just to show you, each of these specimens has a tag on it, which carries the name of the animal. And so it's in part, you know, showing this crazy sort of fetishistic history that's very important to science, but of humans need to kind of order the environment in order to sort of digest it in their heads. And so we unfortunately sometimes kill things and put them in collections. So it's a, besides being a color spectrum, it's kind of a memorial to this process that is necessary for the creation of knowledge and the communication of things. But yeah, there's some really, I mean, there's personal birds, I think, that are personally cool because they have very interesting stories. This bird here is a Carolina parakeet, which is now extinct, and this specimen was collected in Tampa, Florida in 1882. I think that's one of the oldest specimens on the spectrum. There's also an indigo bunting that was collected on Prospect Street, New Haven. That's from 1883, I think. And if these specimens are housed in climate-controlled situations, they can last for quite a long time. But yeah, there's some personal favorites, and there's also some specimens that were collected on one particular expedition that I joined with the Peabody Museum to Central Suriname, a former Dutch colony north of Brazil, in 2010. So we helicoptered into Central Suriname and were dropped off for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. The leader of our little 4-person crew was Krzysztof Zyskowski, who's the ornithology collections manager at the Peabody. And a couple of the birds were skinned by him. A couple of them were skinned and prepared by me. I also, of course, was making drawings on the trip. But yeah, as I look through the spectrum, there's definitely some favorites. And I see primarily and marvel at just the beauty and diversity of what nature has made, evolution being the greatest artist of all. And as I also said in the introduction, nature makes things. It's testing the limits of what can exist, and all the creatures that nature makes also have an urge to make things. So as somebody who likes to make things, I feel like I just inherited this urge that nature has inherently. There is one more bird that's in the center of the front cover. That was my favorite bird as a kid. It's called a cock of the rock, and it's a bird from South and Central America, and I've seen them now later in life in their leks, where the males, you'll get like 10 to 20 males dancing for one female standing on a branch, and it's quite a raucous show. But so yeah, there's a lot of personal elements to the spectrum. My father grew up in Brazil, and the stories he told me as a kid about watching birds and even trapping them live for a cage on the veranda of their home had a huge impact on me. So there's a lot of South American birds, and some of these birds actually even spend the winter in South America and migrate all the way to New England to breed in the summer. So even if they come from a far place, they're connected to our own ecosystem by animals that move between these places. Migration is something I'm really interested in, so I could talk about the bird spectrum for days.
I could listen to it too. We're really grateful to the Peabody for giving you license to create such an exceptional.
Yeah, I will say that the curator and collections manager, who are both friends of mine, were definitely initially reluctant to let me pin 222 birds to the wall that are irreplaceable, because there are no more Carolina parakeets. They're invaluable resources that now they're using to learn about things like how birds see colors. Birds see entire spectrums of color that humans can't. They can see UV color. So anyway, thank you. You're right, Tiffany. Thank you to Peabody and Dave Skelly, the director, who was open-minded enough to let this whole thing happen, as well as working closely with Stephanie and Larry too.
So we have a question in the Q&A about one of the juxtapositions, a specific juxtaposition that I showed and mentioned in my introduction, and that is the egg and the pollock. So Sarah Lowe writes in and says, James, are you suggesting that patterns in nature influence the designs made by humans? For example, I'm thinking of the pattern found on the egg that you showed and the Jackson Pollock painting.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely not the first to, people have pointed out, noticed that the patterns on eggs look a lot like abstract expressionist paintings. But Christoph helped me sort of find some eggs in the collection that were particularly abstracty, like the common myrrh and the long-tailed grackle and the jacana. I am suggesting that humans, yes, adopt techniques and also patterns from nature. Of course they do. I mean, I can't say for sure that Pollock started making drip paintings because he saw an egg of a seabird on the beach in East Hampton, but in pictures of the studios and the house in the Hamptons, and also Pollock's wife, Lee Krasner, they had a lot of natural history objects on the windowsills and stuff. And so I think the influence of nature on humans and art is hard to track sometimes, but and I most likely Pollock's technique for dripping was not, you know, who knows, maybe he was drunk and he saw a bird egg and he's like, ooh, I could do this. But what's interesting, that actually Edith Devani, the curator at the Royal Academy in London, who wrote the essay, another essay in the book, pointed out to me was that these artists, these abstract expressionist artists, were trying to make a mark that was outside of human thought, that wasn't conscious. So they called it, or maybe art historians call it, automatism, I think. And birds make the purest line that's not conscious. I mean, this drawing on the eggs happens in the oviduct of the bird in the final hours before the eggs being laid. And people have described it, biologists, the egg turns and the pen stays stationary. So the little ink jets, they sometimes call them paint guns, spray these little lines, and the lines are so fine. I mean, I don't know a human instrument, not that I have, that can make a line that fine and that beautiful. So there are many, many marks. I mean, cuneiform has been described as looking like chicken scratch, but I think our first marks were probably imitations of footprints we saw. The first writing is the footprints of animals. That writing is just a method of recording the residue of a thought or experience on a surface, and tracking animals and the marks they left behind was essential to survival, because tracking is a way that a hunter can get close enough to an animal to throw a spear at it or knock it over the head and eat it. But I think we were influenced by our own marks that we made. Some of the first marks that we made were just a hand covered in pigment or blood, or a hand on a wall and blowing pigment through a straw to leave the negative image of a hand. And the hand image is still very important to all kinds of artists and non-artists. So, and the techniques of animals, in conversations with Ned Cook in the art history department at Yale, we started looking at birds' nests and the way that weaver birds weave grasses and things together. Birds have been making baskets essentially, you know, for hundreds of thousands of years before humans did. I find it really hard to believe that humans didn't learn early weaving techniques from watching birds build a nest. There's just too much of a similarity. So in the exhibition, we juxtapose human-made baskets with nests. So we beg, borrow, and steal from nature all the time, and we're still doing it. Whether it's marks or Velcro, which is modeled after little birds that have hooks on the ends that catch onto your clothes and stuff. And we're always, you know, these days bioprospecting and mostly tropical places to try to find the next chemical compound that will extend our lives in the jungle. So yes, this nature as a resource for us, but it's nice to try to value nature in its own right and the things that it produces. Anyway, sorry.
Okay,
Stop saying sorry.
we're at 6:30, but I still see quite a few great questions in here. So I think we're going to take just a couple more. Let's see. We've got one that's a little bit about process here. Janine St. Germain asks, what was it like to question the line between art collection, archival collection, and creative art making? Was it challenging, freeing, or both?
The line between, can you say that again?
I think her question is about breaking down these boundaries and questioning the boundary between an art museum and a natural history museum and breaking that all down. Did you find that challenging to bring these juxtapositions together? Was it freeing? Was it a little bit of both?
Yeah, I mean, it's not obviously the first time that natural history objects and art objects have been put together. It was common in early European collections, these cabinets of curiosity or wunderkammer, to put, there were fewer boundaries between the things that humans found to be interesting. So you would have a collection, even the early museum in Philadelphia, the name of the person who put it together will come to me, but you know, a lot of you know who I'm talking about, but Charles Wilson Peale maybe, and the early museums had things like a mastodon skull and a painting next to them, and these, you know, juxtapositions may have been sort of, they were novel, but the people who had access to them probably didn't think as much about it. Since the 18th, 19th century, I think the disciplines have become much more siloed as people have learned more, specialized more. So now we have disciplines that didn't exist before, like art history or even science. Scientist wasn't really a term until I think the 19th century. So it was more common in the old days for an artist, for instance, to accompany a scientific expedition, a naturalist expedition, and art making and what we call now science are. So yeah, but my aim was not to put together a curiosity cabinet. It was to show again that nature and evolution are a force that makes and constructs incredibly beautiful things that without them, we couldn't make what we call art. And we're just makers like evolution. To me, it's very natural to put a dinosaur skull next to a Barbara Hepworth sculpture. She and Henry Moore were extremely deeply influenced by bones. People, if you've seen pictures of Henry Moore's studio, there were bones and pieces of trees all over the place. You know, to me, I love Brancusi's work. Of course, Yale has a couple, or one, the bird sculpture. These kind of reductions of nature are really poetic and allow us to see nature differently when we go back to it. So I just think that this dialogue has always been there between nature-made objects and human-made objects. And it was not the first time again that had been done, but I spent the better part of 2 years or even more thinking about what I wanted to put together. And there are many juxtapositions that didn't happen. The dinosaur skull was just dumb luck that the Peabody was closing down, and that skull had not moved since the 1920s. And luckily, and it fit in the door like by a couple millimeters. So we were just lucky. There was a lot of negotiating and back and forth, and I don't always take no for an answer right away. So as Larry knows, but I appreciate him dealing with me. But thank you. That's a great question, and I could go on and on, but there's more sort of discussions about some of the juxtapositions and why they're there in other parts of the book. there's about 30,000 words in the book, so this is just a small piece what I wrote here.
Maybe for our last question, you could tell us what's next for you. You know, we see a lot of stuff on that floor over there, and I'm assuming you're working on a lot of different things. Could you share a little bit about what you're working on now, or is the sort of topics that you've engaged with in the publication, is that something that you're still engaging with?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the topics in this exhibition are topics that I will continue to hammer on until the day I die. And they definitely evolve, and they kind of gain mass as a snowball does down a hill. And I've been working for maybe 10 or 12 years on a larger book about how and why we name and order nature. Every little project kind of contributes something to the snowball. This Gulf of Maine story that I just started for Geographic has made me confront climate change for the first time in a very real way. I've been kind of avoiding it because it's just such a big elephant, but it's real, and it's important to tackle. I had some exhibitions that have been delayed, I think, maybe not canceled. There's supposed to be one in Shandong province in China this fall that may happen next year, and the Brandywine Museum that I think's been pushed off to 2022, and the Wadsworth Athenaeum. I'm curating a show that'll open in October that will include a work of mine, but it's objects from various institutions in Connecticut that are in something called the Connecticut Art Trail. So I've pulled objects from these different institutions. Some of them are art institutions, some of them aren't. So there's everything from paintings by Barclay Hendricks, who taught at Connecticut College, to Annie Albers and Joseph Albers, who taught and made work in Orange and New Haven, Connecticut. There's buttons and clocks made in Waterbury, guns made in New Haven. It's a very eclectic show. So if you live in Connecticut and are interested. I'm also doing an artist residency at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and we're working on a book that will juxtapose writings of Isabella Stewart Gardner, the founder, who had a very interesting life and supported artists like John Singer Sargent. So combining her writings from travel journals and other things, showing her interest in art and nature with drawings that I'm making when I go up there. So that's been a really rewarding project. And yeah, I could go on, but these things, the timeline changes all the time.
We're all trying to adjust to this.
What's that?
We're all trying to adjust to the
yeah, and I hope that the museum will reopen and I'll be able to take people through and wearing a mask. And but yeah, this pandemic obviously has changed the way a lot of us behave. And what does that mean that such a simple, structured thing that scientists don't even consider a living organism can burn through the planet like a wildfire and change what we do every day? It's kind of interesting. A lot of fuel there.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. But I hope that this has given everybody a little taste of the publication and whetted your appetites for more. It's been great talking with you tonight, James. It's been wonderful to see the gallery community rally around this program, our first ever virtual book launch. Really, really satisfying on my end, and we're so thankful just to have some time with you and talk about this project. As I said, we've got an audio tour for the show. It's on our SoundCloud channel. I think my colleagues also posted it in the chat a couple of times. James recently wrote a blog post for us with Yale University Press, so you can check that out too if you want more information. And the publication, as I said, is available now. through Yale University Press and other online booksellers, and hopefully at those small bookstores that are starting to open in some of the safer states bit by bit. But we will be in touch with the winners of our early registration raffle. And just thanks again. Thanks everybody for joining us. Oh, James has got something, some art to show us.
Active painting.
Active painting. He's going to return to art making, and
I forgot that's something else I do. Yeah. But no, it's just been great, Tiffany. Thank you so much, and thank you to the gallery and everybody who attended. Really been a lot of fun.
Wonderful. Thanks everybody. Have a wonderful evening and stay safe.